couple of announcements before I get started with A&P. One is that this week's biology colloquium is two students presenting research that they did during the summer. Alice Lynn will be talking about research related to leukemia, so cancer, blood cancer. And Malvika will be talking about experiments that she did, I think at the Mayo Clinic, but maybe it was at Harvard, I can't remember, related to neuroinflammation. You may know that Alzheimer's disease is now thought to be a neuroinflammatory disorder disease. So you know, cancer research and neurodegenerative or neuroinflammation research, biology colloquium on Thursday, noon, CST 103. The other announcement that I want to make, I don't have a slide for, is that today, this afternoon at 1 o'clock, is the graduate school fair. There's a grad school fair at the Wellness Center today from 1 to 3. Tomorrow, Wednesday, it says right here, Wednesday. Tomorrow at 1 o'clock in the Wellness Center. And so if you're interested in learning more about graduate schools, I think there'll be some medical schools represented, law schools, if any of you, other forms of post-Earlham education. There's a fair at the Wellness Center. Okay, so now so you've got your exams back. All right, I'll get you your exam. So we have completed the cardiovascular section. We're moving now on to respiratory physiology and anatomy, so the respiratory system. And obviously we're not going to leave the cardiovascular system completely, because we're going to have to talk about blood flow to the lungs and, you know, carrying of metabolites and waste products from the body back to the lungs. So the cardiovascular system will be hitting it again and again and again, but we're going to turn our focus to the respiratory system. So here is a part of an image from your textbook. These are the three most important functions of the respiratory system. And two of them are ones that you know from elementary school or middle school. The respiratory system is what brings oxygen from the atmosphere to the cells, where it is used in the mitochondria for ATP production. What you might remember from cell phys, oxygen is the terminal electron acceptor in the electron transport chain of the inner mitochondrial membrane. We are aerobic organisms. We depend on oxygen. You know that. And we depend on oxygen because we depend on aerobic oxidative phosphorylation for the production of most of our ATP. You could review cell phys if you're interested. I'll be hitting some points there occasionally. You probably remember that the metabolism of glucose and other food products produces carbon dioxide, which we have to get rid of. So we exhale carbon dioxide. What you might not be aware of is that the respiratory system and the kidneys work together to control body pH. Our bodies, we have evolved to have an internal pH of a slightly higher than neutral, 7.4. And our enzymes have adapted to working within a very narrow range of pH. If we go outside of that pH range, intracellularly or in our body, things break down real fast. Not break, they stop working well real fast. Very narrow range of pH. And so the respiratory system and the kidneys work together to control pH. And you'll see that mechanism in the next couple weeks. So, of course, there's anatomy. Here is an example of some terms that you are expected to know. I gave you a handout of the key concepts for this section. So that's your checklist of things to know for the next exam, for this section. The assignments in the coloring book are required, and that's part of the learning process for this course. And so pay attention to which pages are required. There will be terms on the coloring book that you're not responsible for. So again, refer to the handout for the things that you do and don't need to know. Anyway, so let's just go through some anatomical terms. The nasal cavity inside the nose. You know some of these. Nostril. That one's pretty easy, the mouth. The pharynx and the larynx are parts of the respiratory system. They're part of the airway. We'll be talking a little bit more about the larynx when we get to the digestive tract. So you may know that this thing, this little tube here, which does not end here, that's the esophagus, and it goes to the stomach. So there's some funny cartoons, idiosyncrasies. This is the esophagus. It does not end in a little dead end here. It goes to the stomach. The larynx, so the nasal cavity and the mouth connect to the pharynx, and there are, you'll see in the next slide, some details that I'm not going to expect you to know. Connects to the larynx. The larynx connects to the trachea, which we will see, or you may already have seen in the cadaver lab this week. No, you haven't seen it this week, but you may already have seen it in the cadaver, but we will focus on it this week in the cadaver lab. And then the trachea branches into a left and a right main bronchus. That's an anatomical term to know, main bronchus. On the left side and on the right side. And then these branch into bronchi, which is the plural of bronchus. So we have a main bronchus and then a secondary bronchus. And I'm not going to ask you to know secondary versus tertiary versus quaternary bronchus. Main bronchus is the term to know. Then bronchus, which is not the main bronchus, but is a branch from it. And then it branches and branches and branches into tiny little structures that we'll get to the names of in a minute, down here, and up here, all throughout the lungs. I will ask you to know the diaphragm muscle and some other muscles of respiration, as well as the word lung. Although, if you give me lung on an exam or a quiz, I won't count it. It's too easy. So anyway, here's a slide with some of the anatomical terms. And we're going to be using these anatomical terms over and over and over again for the next couple of weeks as we talk about the physiology of the lungs, and we'll use them in the lab when we talk about the anatomy of the lungs. And not just the lungs, the respiratory system. So here's a slide to illustrate that I'm going easy on you in terms of the anatomical terms that I could be expecting you to know. This is more detailed anatomy of the nose, mouth, larynx, and nose, mouth, pharynx, and larynx. I mean, a hardcore anatomist would expect you to know all of these words. Some of them are easy, like nostril. Some of them are easy, like tongue. But then some of them are hard, like this opening called the fauces, and the different tonsils, and the different foldings in the naval cavity called conchae. There's a ton of anatomy in this case that someday you may need to learn, but that day is not today. Okay, so this slide is available to you on Moodle, but you can look at it if you're interested. And if you like challenging yourself with memorization, go ahead and memorize it. But it's not going to be on a test, other than things like the ones that are on the list. Trachea could be on a list, but not very many of these terms. A lot of anatomy, a lot of different, detailed anatomy that we're not covering. So let's talk about the branching of the airway. So the airway is just the set of tubes that brings air, gas, from the atmosphere to the lungs where gas exchange happens. So there's the trachea, right? There's the trachea. No, that's the esophagus. There's the trachea. Or in this cartoon, there's the trachea. Okay, the trachea branches into the left and the right main bronchus, which branches into secondary main bronchus and then secondary bronchi, etc. So there's bifurcations, and so this is just counting up the branches, which you don't need to know, and this is counting the number of those tubes. So this is just 16 is just 4 squared, right? Because we have one on each side, a branch into 2, and then each of those branches into 4 total, etc. So as we get higher and higher number, we get a higher and higher number of branches. And so there are something like 23 branches, 23 bifurcations in the airway. And so by the time we get to 23 branches, we're talking about 8 million tiny little tubes here at the end of this set of branching. 2 to the 23rd is 8 million. So let's just go through the names. We'll talk about trachea, so we're doing anatomy. Trachea, left and right main bronchus, A bronchus, more bronchi, then they get small, and the terminology, if you learn the terminology of arterioles and venules, now we've got something familiar. Bronchi, when they get small enough, become bronchioles. So a word for a tiny bronchus is a bronchiole. Bronchioles branch, and when we get down to the end of this is a dead end pathway for gas exchange. We get to what are called alveoli. Alveoli are where most of the gas exchange happens. And you've got millions of them. Some of the bronchioles have little bulges where gas exchange happens also. So we're going to break down the bronchioles into 2 types. Respiratory bronchioles where gas exchange can happen, as in the alveoli, and terminal bronchioles, which are also called conducting bronchioles, where gas exchange does not happen. So no gas exchange, when I say gas exchange, I mean the exchange of oxygen with blood and the exchange of carbon dioxide with blood. No gas exchange happens here. This is just carrying the gas from the atmosphere to the lungs, or carrying the gases from the lungs to the atmosphere in an exhale. This is just carrying the gases. Gas exchange happens in the respiratory bronchioles and the alveoli. We'll see some more of that and why that is in just a minute. So here's a cartoon from your textbook that shows a terminal bronchiole, which would also be called a conducting bronchiole, because it's not doing respiration, it's just conducting the gases from one place to another. And then you can see some branches that are not shown. And here is a sac of alveoli, an alveolar cluster. So here, alveolar sacs, a cluster of alveolar sacs. And you can see they are heavily vascularized by pulmonary capillaries, because this is where we need an intimate contact between gas and blood in order to do all that gas exchange that we need to get the oxygen your body needs, to get rid of the carbon dioxide that your body needs to get rid of. There are also our friends, the smooth muscles, right? So this ribbon, this red ribbon, is supposed to illustrate smooth muscles. We know what smooth muscles do. They constrict or they relax. And so we have control over the diameter of the airway when it gets really small. And constriction of the airway can be physiological, or it can be pathological. You may know that asthma is a pathological constriction of airway. It's an allergic reaction that causes an abnormal constriction of airway. And we'll talk, I think there's a clinical case about asthma that we'll talk about in the lab at some point. Questions? So here is a sort of a plastic model of the airway. It's not a model. This is actually a human lung where the airway was filled with a plastic, and with like a polymer or something. It was polymerized, and then the tissue was removed away from it, so that all that was left is a cast. I'm sorry, it's just a casting of the airway. And so you can see here the trachea, the right main bronchus and the left main bronchus here, a bronchus, more bronchus. Somewhere in there it becomes a bronchus, it transitions from bronchus to bronchiole. And at the end of the bronchioles are the alveolar sacs, which didn't fill as much as they should have with the polymer. So you should be able to look at a picture like this, and if I point to, this, give me a name for it, bronchus. What we're going to do in this section of the class, of course, that we didn't do in the cardiovascular is do a little bit of histology. Histology is a whole field. Histology is the name of microscopic anatomy. It's the word for being able to identify microscopic structures, which are usually cell types. So in a real histology class, you'd be confronted with a bunch of slides or images from slides, and you'd have to say, what kind of cell is that? What kind of cell is that? What kind of cell is that? And you learn to identify the different cell types. Some of them are easy, like muscle. If it's big and striped, it's a muscle. If it's small and striped, it's probably cardiac muscle. If it's, there are cues that you learn if you're going to become a histologist to learning how to identify different cell types. Histology is one of those courses that medical students and nursing students have to take in order, to complete their degree, because it's an important part of their training to identify cell types. We're going to do just a little bit of that to give you some exposure to histology, but just like with the anatomy of the respiratory system, the amount of histology that I'm going to ask you to learn is really basic. It's just a touch. So we're going to talk about 5 different cell types, and we'll talk about mucus, and what you want to do for each cell type is what are the distinguishing features of that cell type that would allow me to identify it, and what does it do? That's combining the microscopic anatomy with the cellular physiology, which is that's what I'm mostly interested in. So these are names of things to learn. I'm going to use them now in the rest of this class. So here's a histological section, pretty typical one. So this is a section, a slice, through I think this is probably a conducting bronchiole. I'd have to look up in the book what it was from, but it's from an airway. How do I know that? Well, it's got connective tissue on the outside. Well, let's get oriented. So this is the inside of the tube. So the airway is running this way. This is where air is. This is the outside of the tube that is connected, touching the body. And this is an epithelium, that is to say a layer of cells that that lines the airway. And the two of the main types of cells that line the airway are the ciliated cell, and it's been highlighted here with this outline. But so you can see, this outlines a ciliated cell. But here's another one. There's a ciliated cell. We could have outlined that right there. And here's another one right there. And then it's covered with this label, but right there is a ciliated cell, and here's another ciliated cell. And here's another ciliated cell, and then the slice gets a little bit out of alignment. Ciliated cells have cilia. And you'll see in a moment that cilia are essential for the movement of mucus. And you're going to see in a moment that mucus is essential for the physiology of the airway. Kendra?
So are all cells that move mucus just labeled ciliated cells? So, for example, the ones in your stomach?
No, the ones, so the cells in the stomach that move mucus are not ciliated. So we're just talking about the airway. But you know that there is mucus in the digestive tract that we will get to as well. The cells that make mucus are the goblet cells. And how can we identify a goblet cell? Well, it's full of these secretory granules. So here, this is the nucleus of the ciliated cell. Here's the nucleus of the ciliated cell. So that's a nucleus. There's a nucleus. And here are the secretory granules. You can see that this looks different from this. I can see that this looks different from this. And so as you look at these, you get better at it. These are the secretory granules of the goblet cell. So this is where mucus is stored when it's still inside the cell. And then it is secreted by the goblet cells. Is mucus secreted out here? No, mucus is secreted into the airway. So all of your airways, all of your conducting airway, not the respiratory area so much, but the conducting airway is covered with a layer of mucus. The mucus is secreted by the goblet cells and then transported, moved by the cilia. And where is it moved? So let's just talk about, so this is, the respiratory physiologists talk about the mucociliary elevator. So the cilia move the mucus up the airway to the oropharynx, the oral part of the pharynx, and then you swallow it. So you're not even aware of this, but every time you swallow saliva, every time you swallow saliva, you're swallowing a little bit of mucus. I know it doesn't sound like fun, but it's what we do. On the outside, the connective tissue, this is what sort of holds the air, this is the supporting cells and the supporting structures, collagen, that support the diameter of the airway. It's also called the adventitia. If you get into anatomy details, this area is called the adventitia. I'm not going to ask you to know that name. Okay, so let's talk for a minute about mucus. Because it is important, actually. Some of you may know that cystic fibrosis, which is a major genetic disorder of Caucasians, is a disorder of mucus production, and the mucus gets so thick and gooey that the cilia can't move it, and it causes infection and deterioration of the airways. And people die young when they have cystic fibrosis. So what I'm going to do here is get out of this. Do this. And I want to show you some movies about mucus. So we evolved mucus. In fact, by we I mean humans, but we evolved mucus early on in vertebrate evolution. So this is a hagfish, one of the most primitive vertebrates on Earth. And they have a specialization, which is pretty interesting. So we evolved, we are vertebrates, hagfish are vertebrates. They're the earliest, some of the earliest vertebrates still alive on Earth, and they have an interesting defense mechanism.
Eel, an eel-like fish with no visible defenses. But the shark is in for a big surprise. Choked with slime oozing from hundreds of pores in the fish's body. Researcher Vincent Sinzan from the Museum of New Zealand Te Papa Tongarea and his colleagues went near New Zealand's Great Barrier Island and dropped remote cameras. Attached to the apparatus are blue lights to be as unobtrusive as possible, and a bait bag. Here, at more than a 2,000-foot depth, some of the first to attack the bait were hagfish. Also known
Okay, hagfish, the primitive vertebrates are going after the bait.
as snot eels. At one point, a kite
Here's the hagfish. Appears pretty defenseless to this shark.
fin shark, uninterested in the bait, instead prefers the hagfish, but gets a mouthful of slime. The slime fills the shark's mouth, clogs its throat, and chokes it. The hagfish were seen repeatedly bitten by larger fish, all retreating with the same results. Here, a cat shark seems to be fine in biting down on the hagfish, but eventually turns away as it too is gagged by slime.
So they call it slime. I call it mucus. I guess because it's secreted to the outside of the fish, let's call it slime, but it's the same chemical as what we have as mucus. So we, that is to say vertebrates, evolved, some of us developed mucus as a defense mechanism, and we, as humans, maintained that defense mechanism in our airway. It's part of the defensive mechanism that we have in our airway. So let's just look at a different video. So what the hagfish have these ability to secrete in response to an attack. They have the ability to secrete slime or mucus. We have the same ability to secrete mucus to protect our airway. And so this is the last video.
Okay, yeah.
So what are they doing? They are stimulating right here. They are stimulating with this little electricity. They're stimulating this anesthetized hagfish to secrete some slime. But watch what they can do with it.
Slime. Yeah, you see? Oh, yeah.
Okay, a little bit of slime, a little bit of what is secreted is now being added to a beaker of water.
My official mixing apparatus, let me hold it up. Yeah, then back it up a bit. See? Okay, go for it.
So that tiny little bit of what is secreted then becomes hydrated with about 100 milliliters of water to make 100 milliliters of slime, of mucus. Okay? So we do the same thing. Your goblet cells are secreting a highly concentrated packet of mucus, but then the water that's in your airway, that is also secreted by other cells, hydrates it and makes a very thin but viscous mucus. Okay, so this is always good. So let's go back to this. Okay? Yeah. And those links will be on Moodle, and you can show them to your friends and say, look what I learned in school today. So let's talk about, let's do a clicker on this. Go.
So, like, when you're sick, does that just mean more mucus is, like, secreted?
Your body is stimulating the production of mucus in order to clear the bacteria or viral, cells, not the bacterial cells or the virally generated cells.
So the cilia moving the mucus is acting as, like, the current of the bacteria in the airways.
Let me get to that question after the clicker.
Okay.
Yes, so when you're sick, your body is producing more mucus. Your mucus is being moved by the cilia and getting rid of that mucus that is full of bad bacteria is what your body is trying to do. It's trying to clear the bacteria by clearing more mucus out of your system. Okay, what is mucus? So some of these are give me an opportunity to teach, and some of these are an opportunity to discuss. Okay, so mucus is a combination of mucins. Gross, now that's a subjective opinion. It is not green. Mucus is clear unless you're sick, in which case then you've got some other things in it, and that can give it some color. But ordinary mucus, if you blow your nose in the morning and you're not sick, it's clearish. Mucus is a combination of mucins. Mucins are glycoproteins. So mucus is a secretory protein that is heavily glycosylated. I'm using some of the words from CellPhys that you learned. It's a glycoprotein. O-linked just means the carbohydrate is linked to the protein through oxygen bonds, not through nitrogen or cysteine or whatever. It's just O-linked glycosylation means that tyrosines and serines are the parts of the protein that get glycosylated because they have an oxygen on the side chain, an OH group. Okay, what is the function of mucus? I don't even remember what my answer was, but I think I'm seeing a lot of the correct ones. So mucus traps the bacteria and pathogens, but cilia do the transporting. Okay? Mucus traps, cilia transport. Mucus by itself does not transport anything, it just traps it. So that's the trick there. It does in fact moisturize the airway. We have to keep the airways humidified. I suppose that's not its function, that's it, but yeah, I'd have to accept that as a true answer. It does in fact give you, this is what Joey and I were talking about. When you are sick, it stimulates the production of mucus in order to trap pathogens more. Yes?
So cilia transports the mucus.
Cilia transports them. So let's talk about that for a minute. Let me just see what the next slide is. Let me go back to that other histological section, because there were things I wanted to show here. So, oops. So here's a cell that is secreting the mucins into the airway. It's secreting the mucus, and the mucus is forming a thin film in the airway, right? We don't want to, we're not hagfish. We're not trying to, put a whole bunch of that stuff into this airway. Then we would die of asphyxiation. We're just making a thin film of mucus to protect the surface of the cells here. And then the cilia have a sort of a beating. I should have found a movie, but pretend I'm a ciliated cell. So I've got my cilia. And I'll try to do it so that ciliated, this is up towards the mouth, and that's down towards alveoli. Okay, that's the direction it's transporting. And so my cilia have sort of a wave-like motion like this. Cytoskeleton within the cilia run a constant program. Constant, it's an actin and tubulin-based movement of the cilia. So the cilia are extensions of the surface membrane. So these little tubes here, they look like hairs, but they're not hair. They look like feathers, they're not feathers. They are little tubes of extension of this membrane. And they're filled with tubulin and actin, microtubules and microfilaments. And they do a movement, sort of, something like that. And you can see that based on the way I'm moving, anything that is, I am moving the air a little bit in that direction because of the way I'm moving, right? The mucus are propelling, the cilia are propelling the mucus in one direction. And so you are constantly moving a thin film of mucus up your conducting airways to your mouth and swallowing it. Your nose is producing a thin film of mucus that is usually goes back to your throat, and you swallow it. Only when you're sick and you're aware of the fact that you're dripping all this mucus, does it come out of your nostrils. Okay, so here we have a more detailed look at the surface of an airway. So here is, you can see the cilia, goblet cells that are ready to secrete mucus. Here, in fact, is a goblet cell that has just dumped a little microscopic package of that dehydrated mucus that is now in the process of getting hydrated and forming a film of mucus on this surface of the airway. Brush cells are sensory cells, and they are hard to tell. I mean, I'm not going to ask you to identify a brush cell. I will ask you to identify a ciliated cell, and I'll ask you to identify a goblet cell, and I will ask you to know the function of a ciliated cell and a goblet cell. But brush cells are sensory cells. They're the cells that detect pathogens, irritants. So when you cough after breathing dust, it's because the brush cells in the back of your throat and in your airway are saying, ugh, let's get rid of this. Let's trigger a cough reflex or a sneeze reflex. Okay, so let's do some more clickers. Again, it's not to quiz you, it's to establish the conversation of things that I might have forgotten to teach. So what are cilia? Specifically, what are respiratory cilia? Okay, so some of you missed it when I said it. They are extensions of the surface membrane. They are not collagen. They are not cellulose. We don't have any cellulose. We're not plants. So they're not all of the above. They are tubular extensions of the surface membrane that have cytoskeleton inside that do the movement. So they're tubes of membrane with cytoskeleton. What's the function of the cilia? Cilia are to transport mucus. We're going to have a different mechanism for increasing surface area. We don't have cilia in the respiratory parts of the airway where gas exchange happens. All right, I forget what I think we're moving now into the alveoli. So maybe let me just see what the next slide is. Yeah, let's take a break now, and we'll move from, so what we've just done, we've covered the airway, goblet cells, ciliated cells, some brush cells that I won't test you about. We're moving down this airway into the alveolus, clusters of alveoli, where gas exchange happens. We'll talk about that anatomy and physiology after the break. Just as a reminder, the answer key to the cardiovascular exam is up on Moodle, so I recommend, if you want to know where your points lost. I didn't make a lot of comments on your paper, I just marked negative points for things missing. So go to the answer key to see what I was looking for, to see what you missed. And I'm happy to discuss it. I'm happy if you say, oh, I think I said this right here. I mean, I graded it fast, and some of your handwriting isn't the easiest to read. And so if you think that the word that I was looking for was in there and I just didn't see it, I'm happy for you to point it out to me. So we're moving into the alveoli. One alveolus, two or thousands of alveoli. And this is where gas exchange happens. So this is where most of the physiology of the lungs is, right? We need mucus to clear pathogens as a protective device. We need cilia. We need mucus to bind and trap pathogens. We need cilia to move the mucus and the trapped pathogens and bacteria and things like that. But in terms of the airway, in terms of gas exchange, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and pH control, we need to be focusing on the alveolus. So here are some details about the alveolus. Each one is about 200 micrometers in diameter. Just to give you an example, a red blood cell is, 20 micrometers in diameter. So these are approximately the same size. I mean, they're bigger than red blood cells, but they're only 10 times bigger than a red blood cell. And because you've got millions of them, even though each one is tiny, you have square meters of surface area in your lungs. Just like, you may remember when we talk about the capillaries, each capillary is microscopic in diameter, but because you have billions of them, the total area of the capillary is huge. And so the total area of the total surface area of the alveoli is also very large, in order to give us a large surface area for gas exchange. So we've got millions of these, each one covered with hundreds or thousands of capillaries. So this is where gas exchange happens, at that intimate contact between a microscopic terminus of the airway, the alveolus, and the pulmonary capillaries. So this is a slide I like a lot because it shows an alveolus. So this is where air is. So this is the inner surface of an alveolus. And these holes, these dots, these circles, are capillaries. So you can see the separation, the space that is separating an airway from blood is extremely thin. and we've got millions of them. So we've got lots of contact between air and blood. So this is about the size of a cell. Remember, the red blood cell is squeezing through a capillary, so this is approximately the same size as a red blood cell. And so the alveolus is bigger, but it's not a whole lot bigger. And the membranes that separate, remember this, there are cells here, and there are cells that line this endothelium, but they're all extremely thin to allow intimate contact and diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide. Remember from cell physiology that oxygen and carbon dioxide are two of those molecules that can diffuse through cell membranes. And so diffusion is going to be an important part of this. We don't pump oxygen. We don't pump carbon dioxide. We just let it diffuse. We use passive diffusion, and so we have evolved mechanisms to allow efficient passive diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide. This slide is, I think, informative to show you that intimate contact between air and blood. And here's a cartoon that illustrates the same thing from your textbook. So let's get oriented. This is one image, and this is a different image, right? This is part B, and that's part A. Two different images, but they're sort of semi-overlapped. So this is supposed to be like a cross-section. It's an idealized cross-section of this. So here is the end of the bronchiole, which is it's not a conducting bronchiole, it's a respiratory bronchiole. So there is some gas exchange here, and what do you suppose these little red lines are supposed to illustrate here? Cilia, right? So the bronchioles have cilia, but I have a feeling this is incorrect. I'm not positive, but I think a true respiratory bronchiole would not have cilia. We wouldn't really see very much cilia until we got to a terminal conducting bronchiole, a non-airway, a non-gas exchanging bronchiole. Anyway, the point is bronchioles make the mucus and have the cilia to move the mucus, but the alveolus does not. Normally, we do not have mucus or any fluid inside the alveoli. It's got a layer of water, because cells don't live in air, but it doesn't have mucus. Okay?
So type 2 cells are wrong?
Okay, so the bronchioles have an epithelial cell. Bronchioles have epithelial cells, goblet cells and ciliated cells, but the gas exchange areas have type 1 and type 2 pneumocytes, or type 1 and type 2 cells. So now let's get to the air. So here's an alveolus. Here's an area filled with air. Here's an area filled with air. These red things are supposed to be the capillaries in the cross section, just like you see here. Capillaries captured in cross section, cut, and in the cartoon, they're red. Orangish red. So let's zoom in on this airway. So this is the airway. This is the air inside the alveolus. Out here would be the adventitia, connective tissue. Here is some more connective tissue, the interstitium, connective tissue. Here's a capillary in cross section, endothelial cell lining the capillary, and a red blood cell inside the capillary. And obviously there's plasma, fluid of blood here. So this is blood. Here's a red blood cell. Here is an endothelial, one or a couple of endothelial cells, specialized to be very thin. And here are the type 1 and type 2 alveolar cells. Type 1 cells they're there to make the thin layer that surrounds the airway. Their job is to be thin. Real thin. type 2 cells are also there, and their job is to make what's called surfactant. We'll talk about surfactant on Thursday. So your cells, I mean your alveoli are lined with cells that are specialized for being thin and allowing gas exchange. They're lined with cells that are specialized for making surfactant, which is a fluid, a very thin and sort of soapy fluid that lines the airway, the air side of this alveolus. And then, of course, on the outside, there are the thin-walled capillaries lined with an endothelial cell that contain blood. Hold your questions about surfactant until Thursday. We'll talk about surfactant on Thursday. Bottom line is that surfactant, bless you.
Thank you.
Surfactant is what is required is part of what's required to keep these extremely thin structures inflated, right? Something so thin is going to tend to collapse, and surfactant helps it not collapse. Some of you may know the word surfactant when you, like a chemist. If a chemist talks about surfactant, they're talking about something that is a wetting agent. You may know that, if you, I could have demoed this. So if I put a droplet of water on a, relatively hydrophobic surface, if I just put a droplet of water there, it would ball up like water because of the surface tension of water. But if I put a little bit of dish soap in it, just a tiny bit of dish soap in that droplet, it would just spread out and wet the entire surface. So surfactant, we make a little bit of detergent. We make something like detergent, but we call it surfactant to help wet. And so it helps humidify this airway, and you'll see it helps hold it open. Questions about this anatomy? So this is a simple electron micrograph of this. We're zooming in right here. We're seeing, so here is the cell, the type 1 cell lining the airway. Here is called the basement membrane. Here's a little bit of connective tissue. Here is the endothelial cell that lines the capillary. And here, this big monster here is the red blood cell. So, this is a cell. This is the thickness of the plasma membrane. So this is, now we're talking about, 2 molecules, right? The plasma membrane is 2 molecules thick. And you can see that at this level of magnification, the separation between air and blood is very thin. And what that allows us to do is use simple diffusion to allow gas to move, oxygen to move from air to blood, and CO2 to move from blood to the gas that you exhale efficiently. So I'm not going to ask you to use Fick's law, but this is the equation that defines diffusion. So here, J is, let's just use it for a little while, and I think this is the last slide, so we're almost done for today. This is the flow of anything due to diffusion. This is a constant, so some, it's just a fudge factor that turns the other things into a flow term. So this is the diffusion constant. What is that? What is embedded in the diffusion constant? Well, it's the higher the temperature, the higher the movement. Right? That makes sense. If we move things around fast, they're going to diffuse faster. The size of the molecule. If the inversely proportional to the size of the molecule. So big molecules, lumber around and don't move, and little tiny molecules are jumping around, and so little molecules move faster, and that the size of the molecule is embedded in this diffusion constant. And the viscosity of the fluid, right? Air is not very viscous, so I can move through it pretty fast, but water is viscous, and it's harder for me to move through water than it is to move through air or gas. And so the viscosity of the fluid that the thing is moving through is part of this diffusion constant. So this all makes sense, right? It's higher temperature, faster movement, higher size, slower movement, higher viscosity, slower movement. The flow is also proportional to the surface area. So this is why we have that huge surface area of contact between air and blood. That's why we have millions of this contact, because the total diffusion is proportional to this contact area. And it's inversely proportional to the thickness of the barrier. X is the thickness of the barrier that it's diffusing through. So a thick barrier would prevent diffusion. A thin barrier, like we have, permits rapid diffusion. This is sort of almost microscopic, I mean it's microscopic, but it's almost nanoscopically thin, right? It's, you know, this is the molecule of a bilayer right there. So because of all of these things, we can efficiently allow gas to exchange. But you mess around with any one of these things, and you've got a problem. So let's imagine lung disease, a pathological scarring of this connection. You know, bacteria have caused infections, infections have caused inflammation, inflammation has caused scarring of this, the layer becomes thick, scar tissue is thick, scar tissue makes this turn bigger, preventing sufficient diffusion. Cystic fibrosis leads to scarring of the lung and prevents efficient gas exchange by thickening the barrier. Emphysema is the destruction of alveoli. So in emphysema, the total surface area goes down because the alveoli have been destroyed. Drowning, putting water in the airway prevents gas exchange. Oh, and one last bit of information. I hope this is inspirational. The people who worked out these relationships, there's an equation that defines the diffusion coefficient in all terms of all these things. The two scientists who worked out that equation, which I'm not going to show you, but it's a pretty simple equation. One is named Stokes, and the other is named Einstein. That is Albert Einstein. His first publication was on understanding diffusion, and then he went on to special and general relativity and all the other things that you've heard of Einstein. But Albert Einstein, who'd have thought that you'd be thinking about Albert Einstein in a physiology, anatomy and physiology class, and yet he is essential to understanding diffusion, and diffusion is essential to understanding the respiratory system. So I hope that's inspirational. You've just increased your connection to Albert Einstein. Okay, so that's really all we're going to do today. So today's a short day. Thursday we'll come back and talk about surfactant and some other things. Remember to keep up with the reading. Remember to keep up with the coloring book, and use the key concepts to guide your studies.